When a wealthy divorced CEO witnesses a kind waiter helping a hungry little girl on the street, she never imagined this moment would change her heart forever. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. The December wind cut through downtown Chicago like a knife, sending pedestrians hurrying past the elegant storefronts on Michigan Avenue. Margaret Foster pulled her designer coat tighter as she stepped out of her black sedan, the door held open by her driver, James Dodd at 68. Margaret commanded respect wherever she went. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her jewelry understated, but expensive, and her presence unmistakable. As the widow of real estate mogul Charles Foster, she had inherited not just his fortune, but his reputation for cold business dealings. "Pick me up in 2 hours," she instructed James curtly, adjusting her leather gloves. Margaret was heading to her monthly charity board meeting, a social obligation she fulfilled more for appearances than genuine care. The Foster Foundation donated millions annually, but Margaret treated it like any other business transaction. Efficient, detached, professional. As she walked toward the Fairmont Hotel, something made her stop. Two small figures huddled against the building's marble exterior, partially hidden behind decorative pillars. Twin girls, no more than 5 years old, with tangled blonde hair and clothes far too thin for the bitter weather. The children clutched worn teddy bears against their chests, their bright blue eyes scanning the passing crowd with a mixture of hope and fear. Their matching pink coats were clean, but obviously secondhand, with patches sewn carefully over holes. "Please, mister," one of the girls called to a businessman hurrying past. "We're hungry." The man didn't even glance their way. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that made her pause mid-step. She had passed countless homeless individuals over the years, always averting her eyes, always finding reasons why it wasn't her problem. But these children— "Please, lady," the other twin said, noticing Margaret's gaze. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Their voices were small but clear, their blue eyes impossibly large in their thin faces. Margaret found herself unable to look away, her usual defensive barriers crumbling as she stared at these two innocent souls. For the first time in decades, Margaret Foster felt her heart begin to crack open. Margaret stood frozen on the sidewalk, her manicured hand gripping her purse strap as she stared at the twin girls. The charity board meeting she was supposed to attend suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the sight before her. "What are your names?" she heard herself asking, surprising even herself as she approached the children. "I'm Emma," said the girl. On the left, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Ella. We're twins. Where are your parents?" Margaret asked, crouching down despite her expensive coat touching the cold concrete. The girls exchanged a look that seemed far too mature for their young faces. "Mama got sick and went to heaven," Ella explained simply. "Daddy said he had to go find work, but that was many days ago." Margaret's heart clenched. She had spent 40 years building walls around her emotions, turning herself into the Ice Queen of Chicago society after losing her own daughter in a car accident decades ago. But these children were dismantling those barriers with every word. "Are you hungry right now?" Margaret asked softly. Both girls nodded eagerly, their teddy bears bobbing with the movement. Without thinking, Margaret stood and flagged down a nearby hot dog vendor. "6 hot dogs, please, and 2 hot chocolates." She turned back to the girls. "What else would you like?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You're really going to feed us?" "Of course I am," Margaret replied, though she couldn't quite believe the words coming from her own mouth. As the vendor prepared the food, Margaret found herself studying the children more closely. Despite their circumstances, they were remarkably well-behaved and polite. Their clothes, while worn, were clean. Someone had been caring for them. even if inadequately. "Where do you sleep at night?" she asked gently. "In the warm place behind the bakery," Emma said. "The nice man there gives us leftover bread sometimes." Margaret's throat tightened. These babies were living on the streets, surviving on scraps and the kindness of strangers. The thought was unbearable. When the food arrived, she watched in amazement. As the girls shared everything equally, making sure each had exactly the same amount. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, and thanked her repeatedly between mouthfuls. "You're an angel," Ella whispered. Chocolate warming her pale cheeks, Margaret felt something break open inside her chest, something that had been frozen for 25 years. As tears threatened to spill from her eyes, she realized her perfectly. Ordered world was about to change forever. The charity meeting was completely forgotten. Margaret canceled her meeting with a quick text. Unable to tear herself away from Emma and Ella, she led them to a nearby cafe, watching as they marveled at the warm interior and soft lighting. "Tell me more about your daddy," Margaret said gently as the girls finished their second helping of sandwiches. Emma's face fell. "He said he loved us, but he had to go find money. He promised he'd come back, but—" She trailed off, looking at her sister. "But it's been 2 weeks," Ella finished quietly. "We keep waiting where he left us, but he doesn't come." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, not at the children, but at the man who had abandoned them. How could anyone leave these precious souls to fend for themselves? "Do you remember your last name?" she asked. "Williams," Emma said. "Emma and Ella Williams. Daddy said to always remember that." Margaret pulled out her phone discreetly, making mental notes. If these children had been abandoned, there would be missing persons reports, social services involvement. Someone had to be looking for them. "Mrs. Lady," Ella said suddenly, "are you going to leave us too?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She looked into those trusting blue eyes and realized she couldn't walk away. Not from this, not from them. "No, sweetheart," she heard herself saying. "I'm not going anywhere." For the next hour, Margaret listened as the twins shared fragments of their story. Their mother had died of cancer 6 months ago. Their father, overwhelmed and grieving, had tried to care for them, but struggled with drinking and depression. Bills piled up, the apartment was lost, and they'd been living in his car until 2 weeks ago when he simply disappeared. He was crying. "A lot," Emma explained. "He said we deserved better than him." Margaret's heart shattered completely. This wasn't a case of malicious abandonment. This was a broken man who thought he was protecting his children by leaving them. It was tragic and devastating, an utterly heartbreaking dot as snow began to fall outside the cafe windows. Margaret made a decision that would change everything. "Girls," she said carefully, "how would you feel about coming home with me tonight? Just until we figure out what to do next." The twins looked at each other with hope and uncertainty. "Would we be safe?" Ella whispered. "You would be very safe," Margaret promised, meaning every word. "And warm, and fed, and loved." The last word surprised her, but she realized it was absolutely true. Margaret's penthouse apartment on Lake Shore Drive had never felt so enormous or so empty. As the elevator doors opened to reveal her marble foyer and crystal chandelier, she watched Emma and Ella's eyes grow wide with wonder. "Is this a palace?" Emma whispered, clutching her teddy bear tighter. "It's just my home," Margaret replied softly, suddenly seeing her luxurious space through their innocent eyes. The imported Italian marble, the priceless artwork, the floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking Lake Michigan. It all seemed excessive. Now Ella reached out tentatively to touch a bronze sculpture. "Are you a queen?" Margaret knelt down to their level. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a woman who's been very lonely for a very long time." The admission surprised her with its honesty. "Since Charles's death 5 years ago, and especially since losing." Her daughter Sarah decades earlier, Margaret had filled her life with business, charity obligations, and social appearances. But she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone actually need her. "Are you hungry again?" she asked, leading them toward the kitchen. Both girls shook their heads politely, though Margaret suspected they were simply overwhelmed. She opened her massive refrigerator, realizing with embarrassment that it contained mostly wine, leftover takeout from expensive restaurants, and ingredients for meals she never cooked. "I'll order us some dinner," she said, reaching for her phone to call her usual upscale delivery service. Then she paused, looking at the children's simple, practical clothes. "Actually, what would you like to eat?" "Anything," Emma said quickly. "We're not picky." "But if you could have anything in the whole world?" Margaret pressed Dot. The twins exchanged glances. "Spaghetti and meatballs?" Ella ventured hopefully. "With lots of cheese?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in years. "Spaghetti and meatballs it is." While they waited for the food, Margaret showed the girls around the apartment. They were fascinated by everything: the massive television, the grand piano she never played anymore, the walk-in closet full of designer clothes. "Did you live here with your little girls?" Emma asked, noticing framed photos of Sarah on the mantelpiece. Margaret's breath caught. "I had one daughter. Her name was Sarah. She..." "She went to heaven when she was 16. Like our mama," Ella said softly, slipping her small hand into Margaret's. "It makes you sad, doesn't it?" "Very sad," Margaret admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But now you have us," Emma declared, matter-of-factly. "We can be your little girls if you want." The simple, innocent offer broke Margaret's heart wide open. These children, who had lost everything, were offering to fill the void in her life with their presence. When dinner arrived, they sat at her formal dining table, the one that hadn't hosted guests in years. Margaret watched in amazement as the twins carefully used their napkins, said grace before eating, and complimented every bite. "This is the best spaghetti in the whole world," Ella announced seriously Dot as Margaret tucked them into the guest room that night, using sheets that had never been slept on. She realized her perfectly controlled world had been turned upside down in a single day. "Mrs. Margaret?" Emma called softly in the darkness. "Yes, sweetheart? Thank you for saving us." Margaret kissed their foreheads, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving me too." Margaret woke at dawn to the sound of whispered voices and soft giggles coming from the kitchen. She found Emma and Ella standing on chairs, carefully attempting to make breakfast. Flour dusted the marble countertops, and what appeared to be pancake batter dripped from a mixing bowl. "We wanted to surprise you," Emma explained sheepishly when she saw Margaret in the doorway. "Daddy taught us how to make pancakes. We're not very good at it yet," Ella added, gesturing to the mess they'd created. Instead of being upset about her pristine kitchen, Margaret felt her heart swell with warmth. "Let me help you," she said, rolling up the sleeves of her silk robe. Together, they created the most chaotic and wonderful breakfast Margaret had experienced in decades. The pancakes were slightly lopsided. The kitchen looked like a war zone. But the laughter filling the space was pure magic. "Mrs. Margaret," Emma said as they ate, "what's going to happen to us?" The question Margaret had been dreading all night. She had called her lawyer first thing that morning, learning the harsh realities of their situation. Without a next of kin willing to take custody, the twins would enter the foster care system. They could be separated, placed in different homes, lost in bureaucratic shuffle. "I'm going to make sure you're taken care of," Margaret said carefully. "Whatever that means." Her phone rang. Detective Rodriguez from Chicago PD returning her call about the Williams case. "Ma'am, we do have a missing persons report filed 2 weeks ago," the detective explained. Robert Williams, 34, reported his daughters missing after leaving them at a church. He claimed they wandered off, but witnesses say he dropped them off and drove away. Margaret's blood boiled. Where is he now? Unknown. His vehicle was found abandoned downstate 3 days ago. We're treating it as a potential suicide, though no body has been recovered. Margaret's heart broke for the girls who were coloring peacefully at the table, unaware their father might be gone forever. "What happens to the children?" she asked quietly. "They'll go into emergency foster care today, unless a relative steps forward." Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. "I want to apply for emergency custody." The detective paused. "Ma'am, are you a relative?" "No, but I'm the one caring for them right now. They're safe, fed, and happy." Surely that counts for something. After ending the call, Margaret sat with the twins and gently explained that some people would be coming to talk with them today. Social workers, possibly police officers. She assured them they were safe, but didn't promise they wouldn't be separated. "Will you come with us if they take us away?" Ella asked, her blue eyes filled with worry. "I'm going to do everything in my power to keep you with me," Margaret promised. "But I need you to be brave, okay? And honest about everything." That happened. Later that morning, Margaret called her lawyer, Harold Steinberg, who had handled her family's legal affairs for 30 years. "Margaret, what you're proposing is extremely complicated," Harold warned. "Emergency custody for non-relatives is rarely granted, especially to someone with no experience with children." "Harold, I haven't felt this alive in 25 years. Margaret said firmly. "These children need me, and I need them. Make it happen." As she hung up, Margaret realized she was prepared to fight the entire legal system if necessary. These weren't just 2 homeless children anymore. They were her girls, and she would move heaven and earth to protect them. The battle was just beginning. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 p.m., just as Harold had warned. Margaret smoothed her navy blazer and opened the door to find Detective Rodriguez, accompanied by a stern-looking woman in her 50s carrying a clipboard. "Mrs. Foster, I'm Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services," the woman announced briskly. "We need to speak with Emma and Ella Williams immediately." Margaret's protective instincts flared. "Of course, they're in the living room. But I'd like to be present during any questioning." "That won't be possible," Ms. Morrison replied coldly. "We need to interview the children privately to ensure they haven't been coached." "Coached?" Margaret's voice rose. "These children have been through enough trauma. They don't need to be interrogated by strangers." Detective Rodriguez stepped forward diplomatically. "Mrs. Foster, we appreciate what you've done, but we have protocols. The children's safety is our priority." Margaret bit back her sharp response. Knowing that antagonizing these people wouldn't help Emma and Ella, she led them to the living room where the twins were building an elaborate castle with blocks Margaret had hastily purchased that morning. "Girls, these people need to ask you some questions," Margaret said gently. "Tell them the truth about everything, okay?" Emma and Ella nodded solemnly, their small hands reaching for each other as the adults approached. For the next hour, Margaret paced her kitchen while muffled voices drifted from the living room. Occasionally, she heard one of the girls crying softly, and it took all her self-control not to burst through the doors. When the officials finally emerged, Miss Morrison's expression was unchanged. "Mrs. Foster, while we appreciate your intervention, these children need to be placed in an appropriate foster home immediately." "This is an appropriate home," Margaret countered. "They're safe, cared for, and loved." "You have no experience with children, no training in child psychology, and no legal standing," Ms. Morrison rattled off. "We have a lovely family in Naperville who specializes in emergency placements. Will they be kept together?" Margaret demanded. We try to keep siblings together when possible, but sometimes separate placements are in the children's best interests. Margaret felt her world tilting. You want to separate them? They're twins. They've lost everyone they've ever loved. And now you want to tear them apart? Mrs. Foster, please calm down. Detective Rodriguez intervened. The system isn't perfect, but it's designed to protect children. Emma, Ella, Margaret called out. Come here, please. The twins appeared hesitantly, their eyes red from crying. Emma clutched her teddy bear, while Ella held tightly to Margaret's hand. Are you going to take us away from Mrs. Margaret? Emma asked Miss Morrison directly. Sweetheart, we're going to take you somewhere you'll be very safe, the social worker replied in a patronizing tone. But we're already safe, Ella protested. Mrs. Margaret saved us. She's our family now. Margaret knelt down and pulled both girls into a fierce hug. Listen to me, my darlings. Sometimes grown-ups have rules that don't make sense. But I promise that I will fight for you every single day until you come home. To me, this is highly irregular, Ms. Morrison huffed. Mrs. Foster, you're making this harder than it needs to be. As the officials prepared to leave with the twins, Margaret made one final desperate plea. Give me 72 hours to file for emergency custody, she said. Keep them together until then. Please. Miss Morrison hesitated, perhaps moved by the genuine anguish in Margaret's voice. 3 days. But if your petition is denied, they go. To separate homes. That's final. Margaret had never fought harder for anything in her life. The war for her daughters had begun. Margaret didn't sleep for the next 72 hours. Her dining room table became a war room, covered with legal documents, character references, and financial statements. Harold worked around the clock, calling in favors from judges and child advocacy attorneys across the city. Margaret, I have to be honest, Harold said on the second day, his usually confident demeanor showing cracks. The system is designed to favor trained foster families. Your wealth actually works against you here. They'll argue you're trying to buy children. Then what do I do? Margaret demanded, her voice hoarse from stress and crying. We need character. Witnesses who can speak to your capacity for love and care. People who knew you before Charles died, before you closed yourself off. Margaret's heart sank. In her years of grief and isolation, she'd pushed away most of her friends. Her social circle consisted of business associates and charity board, members who knew her as the Ice Queen of Chicago society. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived. Margaret opened her door to find Dr. Elena Vasquez, the pediatrician who had treated Sarah during her final months 25 years ago. Heard through the medical community about your situation, Dr. Vasquez said gently. I had to come. Margaret broke down completely. Elena, I don't know if I can do this. Everyone thinks I'm too cold, too damaged to raise children. Margaret, I watched you fight for your daughter with a fierce love that inspired everyone in that hospital. Dr. Vasquez said firmly. You held Sarah's hand through every treatment, read to her every night, never left her side. That woman didn't disappear. She just went into hiding to protect her broken heart. Dr. Vasquez agreed to testify about Margaret's capacity for love and dedication as a mother. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret's housekeeper, Rosa, who had worked for the family for 15 years, appeared at the penthouse with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Margaret, I must tell you something, Rosa said in her heavily accented English. Since those little angels left, you smile again. You laugh. For 5 years since Mr. Charles died, this house was like a tomb. But for 3 days with Emma and Ella, you were alive. Rosa revealed she had been secretly documenting Margaret's transformation. Photos on her phone of Margaret teaching the twins to bake, reading them bedtime stories, braiding their hair. Evidence of a woman rediscovering her maternal instincts. On the morning of the custody hearing, Margaret dressed carefully in a simple navy suit, approachable but respectful. Harold had warned her that Judge Patricia Coleman was known for her tough stance on unconventional custody arrangements. The courtroom was stark and intimidating. Emma and Ella sat with their court-appointed guardian, stealing glances at Margaret with hopeful eyes that broke her heart. Mrs. Morrison presented her case efficiently. Margaret Foster was an inexperienced, emotionally unavailable wealthy widow, attempting to purchase children to fill a void in her life. The state had identified an excellent foster family who specialized in traumatized twins. Then Harold stood to present Margaret's defense. Your Honor, 3 days ago, Margaret Foster was a woman living in emotional exile. Today, she's fighting for the 2 children who brought her back to life. Love isn't about training or experience. It's about commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to put children's needs above your own. Dr. Vasquez testified about Margaret's devotion as a mother. Rosa showed the photos of Margaret's transformation. Even Detective Rodriguez admitted that the twins seemed genuinely bonded to Margaret. Finally, Judge Coleman asked to speak with Emma and Ella privately. Margaret waited in agony as the future hung in the balance. Everything depended on what 2 traumatized 5-year-olds would tell a stranger about the woman who had saved them. The next few minutes would determine whether love was enough to overcome a broken system. Judge Coleman emerged from her chambers. After 45 minutes with Emma and Ella, her stern expression revealed nothing as she resumed her position at the bench. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the rail in front of her. After speaking extensively with the children, Judge Coleman began. I've learned several important facts. Emma and Ella Williams are remarkably articulate and emotionally aware. For their age, they understand the gravity of their situation and have expressed clear preferences about their future. Margaret held her breath. These children described in detail how Mrs. Foster found them on the street, fed them, brought them to safety, and cared for them. More importantly, they spoke about feeling safe and loved for the first time since their mother's death. Ms. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in her seat. However, the judge continued, I must also consider the state's concerns about placing children with an untested guardian, regardless of her financial means or good intentions. Margaret felt her world collapsing. She looked at Emma and Ella, who were holding hands and watching her with complete trust in their eyes. Therefore, Judge Coleman said, I am granting Mrs. Foster temporary emergency custody for a period of 6 months, with the following conditions: mandatory parenting classes, weekly home visits from child services, and psychological evaluations for all parties involved. Margaret gasped, hardly believing what she'd heard. Furthermore, the judge added with the hint of a smile, Emma informed me that Mrs. Margaret reads the best bedtime stories and makes hugs that fix everything. Ella added that she makes the sad go away. In my 30 years on this bench, those might be the most compelling character references I've ever heard. The courtroom erupted. Harold pumped his fist, Dr. Vasquez wiped away tears, and Rosa crossed herself gratefully. But Margaret only had eyes for Emma and Ella, who were running toward her with arms outstretched. We get to go home. Emma cried, launching herself into Margaret's arms. We told the judge lady you were the best mama ever, Ella added, wrapping her small arms around Margaret's neck. Margaret sobbed, openly holding her daughters, because that's what they were now, officially and completely. All the walls she'd built around her heart had crumbled completely. Miss Morrison approached with considerably less hostility than before. Mrs. Foster, I'll be conducting weekly visits. I hope you understand this isn't personal. It's about the children's welfare. I understand completely, Margaret replied graciously. You're welcome in her home any time. As they left the courthouse, Harold pulled Margaret aside. You know this is just the beginning, right? You'll have to prove yourself every day for the next 6 months. One mistake, and they could reverse this decision. Margaret looked at Emma and Ella, who were chattering excitedly about going home. To their castle, and their toys, and their room with the princess beds. Harold, I've spent 25 years as a successful businesswoman. Managing a corporation was nothing compared to this. I'm going to be the best mother these girls could possibly have. That evening, as Margaret tucked Emma and Ella into their beds, Emma looked up at her with serious blue eyes. Mrs. Margaret, are you going to be our mama forever now? If you'll have me, Margaret whispered, brushing blonde hair from the child's forehead. We choose you, Ella declared sleepily. We choose you forever and ever. Margaret had spent decades accumulating wealth and power, but nothing had ever made her feel as rich as those 7 simple words. 3 weeks into their new life together, Margaret's penthouse had transformed from a sterile showcase into a genuine home. Toys were scattered across the marble floors. Children's artwork decorated the refrigerator, and the sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for years. Margaret threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she'd once applied to business deals. She enrolled in every parenting class Chicago offered, read dozens of child psychology books, and turned her home office into a playroom complete with art supplies, puzzles, and a reading corner. Mrs. Margaret, you don't have to be perfect, Dr. Sarah Chun, the family therapist assigned to their case, reminded her during their weekly session. Children need authentic love, not perfection. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being constantly evaluated. Ms. Morrison's weekly visits felt like inspections, with the social worker taking notes on everything from the girls' behavior to the contents of their lunchboxes. The twins, however, were blossoming. Emma's shy smile appeared more frequently, while Ella's natural chattiness returned. They still had nightmares about their father, and occasionally asked when he was coming back. But Margaret handled each difficult moment with growing confidence. Real test came on a snowy Thursday evening when Ella spiked a fever of 103 degrees. Margaret had dealt with countless business crises, but nothing had prepared her for the terror of a sick child. It's probably just a virus, Dr. Vasquez assured her over the phone, but bring her to the emergency room to be safe. Margaret bundled both girls into the car, Emma insisting she wouldn't leave her sister's side. At Northwestern Memorial's pediatric emergency room, Margaret paced frantically while doctors examined Ella. Mama Margaret, Emma whispered, using the name they'd recently started calling her. Is Ella going to go to heaven like our first mama? The question stopped Margaret cold. She knelt down and pulled Emma into her arms, realizing this was a defining moment in their relationship. No, sweetheart, she said firmly. Ella has a fever, which means her body is fighting off germs. The doctors are going to help her feel better, and we'll take her home tomorrow. Promise? I promise, Margaret said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Ella's fever broke by morning, and the doctor confirmed was indeed just a virus. But as Margaret carried her exhausted daughter to the car, she realized something profound had shifted. The fear she'd felt wasn't about failing an evaluation. It was the pure, protective instinct of a mother terrified of losing her child. That weekend, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called Harold and instructed him to liquidate several investment properties. Are you having financial difficulties? Harold asked, concerned. No, Margaret replied, watching Emma and Ella build a blanket fort in the living room. I'm creating a trust fund for the girls' education and future. And I'm also donating $1 million to establish a family reunification program at Child Services. Margaret, that's incredibly generous, but why now? Margaret smiled, remembering Miss Morrison's surprise when she'd mentioned the donation during her latest visit. Because I understand now that there are other families like ours. Children who need loving homes and adults who need children to love. If I can help even one family stay together, then everything we've been through will have meaning. That evening, as Margaret read bedtime stories to her daughters, Emma looked up at her thoughtfully. "Mama Margaret, are you happy now?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret replied honestly. "Good," Ella mumbled sleepily. "Because we were. Sad for a long time, too, but now we're a real family." Margaret kissed their foreheads, marveling at how two small children had taught her more about love and purpose than decades of business success ever had. Margaret's phone rang at 6:30 a.m. on a crisp March morning, jolting her from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. The caller ID showed Detective Rodriguez's number, and her blood ran cold. "Mrs. Foster, I need to see you today. It's about Robert Williams." An hour later, Margaret sat in the detective's office, while Emma and Ella were safely at their new preschool. A milestone that had filled Margaret with both pride and anxiety just weeks earlier. "We found him," Detective Rodriguez said without preamble. "Robert Williams is alive." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her. "Alive? But you said he's been in a psychiatric facility downstate. Attempted suicide, but survived. He's been receiving treatment for severe depression and addiction." The detective leaned forward. "Mrs. Foster, he's asking to see his daughters." Margaret's carefully constructed world suddenly felt fragile as glass. "What does this mean for our custody arrangement?" "Legally, if he can prove he's mentally stable and capable of caring for the children, he could petition for their return." Margaret drove home in a daze, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had known this moment might come. Harold had warned her that biological parents' rights were nearly impossible to terminate permanently. But she had pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on building a life with Emma and Ella. That afternoon, Margaret sat the twins down for the most difficult conversation of their new life together. "Girls, I need to tell you something important," she began carefully. "Your daddy. Your first daddy. He's alive." Emma's eyes widened. "He is? Where has he been?" "He's been very sick, sweetheart. Sick in his mind and his heart. But he's getting better now, and he wants to see you." Ella climbed into Margaret's lap, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Does that mean we have to leave you?" Margaret's heart shattered, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know yet, baby. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I will always love you. Always." "But we don't want to go back," Emma said quietly. "We want to stay with you. What if Daddy is different now?" Ella added. "What if he's not sad anymore?" Margaret struggled with how to handle the situation ethically. These children had been abandoned and traumatized, but she also understood that their father had been suffering from mental illness. She couldn't poison them against him, but she also couldn't bear the thought of losing them. That evening, Margaret called Dr. Chun for an emergency session. "Margaret, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that supervised visits could lead to reunification," the therapist said gently. "But you also need to trust the process. The court will prioritize what's best for Emma and Ella." "What if what's best for them isn't what's best for me?" Margaret asked, voicing her deepest fear. "Then you'll have to love them enough to let them go," Dr. Chun replied. "But we're not there yet. Let's focus on helping the girls process this news and preparing them for whatever comes next." 2 days later, Margaret received another call from Detective Rodriguez. Robert Williams wanted to meet with her before seeing his daughters. "He specifically requested to speak with you first," the detective explained. "He says he needs to thank the woman who saved his children." Margaret agreed. To the meeting, knowing she needed to face the man whose actions had brought Emma and Ella into her life. She needed to look into his eyes and understand whether he was truly capable of being the father these precious children deserved not, as she prepared for what could be the most important conversation of her life. Margaret realized that loving someone sometimes meant being willing to fight for them, and sometimes it meant being brave enough to let them go. The meeting that would determine their family's future was scheduled for tomorrow. The visiting room at the psychiatric facility felt sterile and cold despite the cheerful artwork on the walls. Margaret sat across from Robert Williams, studying the man who had forever changed her life by abandoning his children. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his mid-30s, with the same bright blue eyes as Emma and Ella. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, and dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights filled with regret. "Mrs. Foster," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my girls." Margaret remained silent, waiting to hear his explanation. "I know what you must think of me," Robert continued, tears already forming in his eyes. "What kind of father abandons his children? What kind of monster leaves two little girls on the street?" "That's exactly what I want to know," Margaret replied firmly, but not unkindly. Robert took a shaky breath. "When Lisa died, their mother, I fell apart completely. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't work. I started drinking to numb the pain, but it only made everything worse. Bills piled up, we lost our apartment, and I was living in my car with two babies who deserved so much better." Margaret listened as he described the months of desperation that followed his wife's death from cancer. "I kept telling myself I'd get better, that I'd find a job and a place to live. But every day I failed them more. Emma started having nightmares. Ella stopped talking for weeks. They were starving because I couldn't even manage to feed them properly." "So you left them at a church," Margaret stated. I thought someone would find them quickly and give them the life I couldn't provide. I planned to come back when I got my life together, but," Robert's voice broke, "but I drove to that bridge planning to end it all. I couldn't live with what I'd become." Margaret felt a complicated mix of anger and sympathy. "But you survived. A trucker saw me on the bridge and called police. I've been here ever since, getting treatment for depression and grief counseling. For the first time in 2 years, I can think clearly." Robert looked directly at Margaret, and the first clear thought I had was wondering if my daughters were safe. "They're more than safe," Margaret said. "They're loved, cherished, and thriving." "I know. Detective Rodriguez told me about the custody hearing, about how you fought for them." Robert wiped his eyes. "Mrs. Foster, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." Margaret braced herself. "Do they remember me? Do they ask about me? Or have they moved on?" The question hung in the air like a bomb. Margaret could lie, could tell him the girls never mentioned him. It would be the easiest way to protect her family. But looking at this broken man who was genuinely trying to heal, she couldn't bring herself to be cruel. "They ask about you sometimes," she admitted. "They wonder where you are and why you left. But Robert, they're building a new life. They call me Mama Margaret. They have friends at school, they're in dance class, they have stability." Robert nodded, fresh tears flowing. "I want to see them just once. I need to tell them I'm sorry and that I love them." "And then what?" Margaret asked, her protective instincts flaring. "You can't just pop back into their lives and then disappear again if things get difficult." "I don't know," Robert admitted. "I'm not even sure I'm capable of being the father they need. But I'm getting better, Mrs. Foster. My doctors say I'm responding well to treatment." Margaret studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or false promises. Instead, she saw genuine remorse and a man struggling to rebuild himself. "If I agree to supervised visits," she said carefully, "you need to understand that Emma and Ella's emotional well-being comes first. If seeing you causes them distress, we stop immediately." Robert nodded eagerly. "Whatever you think is best. You know them better than anyone now." As Margaret left the facility, she realized she was about to face the greatest test of her love for her daughters, sharing them with the man who had given them life. Margaret spent 3 sleepless nights preparing Emma and Ella for their father's visit. She consulted Dr. Chun extensively, role-played different scenarios, and created a safety plan in case the girls became overwhelmed. "Remember, sweethearts," Margaret said as they drove to the supervised visitation center, "if you feel scared or uncomfortable at any time, you just tell me and we'll take a break." "What if we don't remember him?" Emma asked quietly from the back seat. "Then you tell him that," Margaret replied. "It's okay to feel however you feel." Ella clutched her teddy bear tighter. "Will he look different?" "He might, baby. But his eyes will be the same blue as yours." The Family Services Building felt institutional despite efforts to make it welcoming. Margaret sat in the observation room with Ms. Morrison, while Emma and Ella entered the visiting room where Robert waited. Margaret's heart clenched as she watched through the one-way mirror. Robert sat at a small table. He began crying immediately. "Emma? Ella?" he whispered, as if afraid they might disappear. The twins hung back near the door, studying this man who claimed to be their father. Margaret could see their confusion and uncertainty. "You look different." "Daddy," Emma said finally, her voice small and cautious. "I'm healthier now," Robert replied, not moving toward them. "I've been sick for a long time, but I'm getting better." Ella stepped forward slightly. "Why did you leave us?" The question everyone had been dreading. Robert's face crumpled, but he answered honestly. "Because I was very sick in my mind, and I thought you would be safer without me. But I was wrong. I should have asked for help instead of leaving you alone." "We were scared," Emma said, still keeping her distance. "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry you were hungry and cold. I'm sorry for everything." Margaret watched, her emotions torn between protectiveness and sympathy. As this broken family tried to reconnect dots slowly, over the course of the hour-long visit, the girls began to warm up slightly. Ella showed Robert her teddy bear, explaining that Mama Margaret had bought it for her. Emma told him about their new school and dance classes. "Mama Margaret takes good care of us," Ella said matter-of-factly. "She reads us stories and makes pancakes and hugs us when we have bad dreams." Robert's eyes found the mirror, knowing Margaret was watching. "I'm glad," he said sincerely. "Mama Margaret sounds wonderful." When the visit ended, the girls hugged Robert goodbye, tentatively but genuinely. As they walked back to Margaret, Emma looked thoughtful. "He seemed sadder but nicer," she observed. "Are we going to see him again?" Ella asked. "Do you want to?" Margaret asked carefully. Both girls nodded. "But we still want to live with you," Emma added quickly. That evening, Margaret received a call from Robert's social worker. He was requesting regular visitation with the goal of eventual reunification. "Mrs. Foster, I need to be honest with you," the social worker explained. "Mr. Williams is making excellent progress. His therapists believe he could be ready for increased custody within 6 months. Margaret felt her world tilting again. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the court might consider transitioning the girls back to their biological father, starting with overnight visits and eventually full custody." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her living room, watching Emma and Ella play with their dolls. They were building a dollhouse family, a mother, 2 daughters, and interestingly, they'd added a father figure to their play for the first time since she'd known them. Margaret realized that Robert's return might not just threaten her custody of the girls, it might actually be the beginning of healing their fractured family. But that healing might require sacrifices she wasn't sure she was strong enough to make. The next chapter of their story was about to unfold, and Margaret had no idea how it would end. 6 months of supervised visits had transformed Robert Williams from a broken stranger into someone Emma and Ella genuinely looked forward to seeing. Margaret watched through the observation window as her daughters laughed at their father's silly jokes and showed him their latest artwork. "He's doing remarkably well," Dr. Chon told Margaret during their weekly session. "The girls are bonding with him again, and his mental health evaluations show consistent progress." Margaret's stomach churned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the court is likely to approve his petition for overnight visitation next month. And if that goes well..." Dr. Chun paused delicately. "Margaret, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility of reunification." That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling while Emma and Ella slept peacefully in the room next to hers. She had spent 8 months becoming their mother, fighting for them, loving them with every fiber of her being. The thought of losing them felt like dying, but she also couldn't ignore what she was witnessing. Robert was becoming the father he should have been all along. He was sober, stable, employed at a local auto shop, and living in a modest but clean apartment that Child Services had approved. More importantly, Emma and Ella were opening their hearts to him again. "Mama Margaret," Emma said the next morning over breakfast, "Daddy asked if we wanted to have a sleepover at his house next weekend." Margaret's coffee cup rattled as she set it down. "How do you feel about that?" "Excited but also scared," Ella admitted. "What if we have nightmares and you're not there?" "Then Daddy will take care of you," Margaret said, forcing strength into her voice she didn't feel. "And you can call me any time if you need to." The overnight visit was approved, despite Margaret's lawyer's objections. Harold had argued that the transitions were happening too quickly, but Judge Coleman ruled that reunification was in the children's best interests. Margaret packed the girls' overnight bags with shaking hands, including their favorite stuffed animals, comfort blankets, and a photo of the 3 of them together. "We'll be back tomorrow," Emma assured Margaret, sensing her distress. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret replied, hugging them tightly. "Have fun with Daddy." That night, Margaret's penthouse felt like a tomb again. She wandered from room to room, touching the evidence of their life together. Drawings on the refrigerator, toys scattered about, tiny handprints on the windows. Her phone rang at 9 p.m., Robert's number. "Mrs. Foster, I wanted to call and say thank you," he said quietly. "The girls are asleep now, but they talked about you all evening. They love you so much." Margaret felt tears threatening. "They love you too, Robert. More than they're probably ready to admit." "I need you to know," Robert continued, "that I understand what you've done for them. You saved their lives, and you gave them the love and stability I couldn't provide. I will never forget that." "What are you saying?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I'm saying that maybe there's a way for all of us to be part of their lives. Maybe family doesn't have to be just one thing." The next evening, Emma and Ella returned, home bubbling with stories about their time with Robert. They'd cooked dinner together, watched movies, and Robert had told them stories about their mother that they'd never heard before. "Did you miss me?" Margaret asked, hating herself for the needy question. "Of course." Ella threw her arms around Margaret. "But Daddy missed us too. He said he's been missing us every day for 2 years." That night, as Margaret tucked them into bed, Emma looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mama Margaret, are you going to be sad if we love Daddy too?" The question broke Margaret's heart and healed it simultaneously. These wise little girls were trying to navigate an impossible situation with more grace than the adults around them. "No, sweetheart," Margaret whispered. "Love isn't something you run out of. You can love as many people as your heart can hold." But as she turned off their bedroom light, Margaret wondered if her own heart was strong enough to love them enough to let them go. 3 weeks later, Margaret received the call she'd been dreading. Judge Coleman had scheduled a hearing to review Robert's petition for full custody. Harold's voice was grim as he delivered the news. "Margaret, his case is strong. 18 months of consistent sobriety, stable employment, suitable housing, and successful overnight visits. The court typically favors biological parents when they've demonstrated rehabilitation." Margaret hung up and found Emma and Ella in their playroom, building an elaborate city with blocks. They worked together seamlessly, Emma's careful planning complementing Ella's creative chaos. A perfect team born from shared experience and unbreakable bond. "Girls, we need to talk," Margaret said, settling on the floor beside them. Over the next hour, Margaret explained the legal situation as gently as possible. The twins listened with the serious expressions they wore when processing difficult information. "So we might go live with Daddy full-time?" Emma asked. "It's possible," Margaret replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But what about you?" Ella crawled into Margaret's lap. "You'll be all alone again." Margaret's heart shattered. These children, who had already lost so much, were worried about her loneliness. "I'll be okay, baby. What matters is that you're happy and loved." That evening, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called Robert. "I want to withdraw my opposition to your custody petition," she said without preamble. Robert was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're their father, and you've worked hard to become the man they deserve. I won't fight you anymore." "But why? You could probably win if you challenge this." Margaret looked at the photo on her mantel. Emma and Ella on their first day of school, gap-toothed grins shining with confidence and joy. "Because they love you. And because love means wanting what's best for them, even when it breaks your heart." Robert's voice was thick with emotion. "Margaret, I have a proposition. What if we shared custody? Officially?" Margaret's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean joint custody. They could spend weekdays with me and weekends with you, or alternate weeks. You're their mother too, Margaret. You earned that title." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt hope stirring in her chest. The girls would have both parents. Robert continued. They wouldn't have to choose between the father who gave them life and the mother who saved it. Margaret closed her eyes, imagining a future where she didn't have to say goodbye. She whispered, unsure. "Family isn't about blood or law. It's about love. And our girls have more than enough love to go around." 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen watching Emma and Ella help Robert make pancakes for Sunday. Brunch. Flour dusted every surface, but their laughter filled the space with warmth that no amount of money could buy. "Careful, Daddy." Ella giggled as Robert flipped a pancake that landed half on the plate, half on the counter. "Mama Margaret makes them prettier," Emma observed with diplomatic honesty. "But Daddies are funnier," Ella added loyally. The joint custody arrangement had worked better than anyone dared hope. The girls spent school weeks with Robert in his cozy apartment, learning to cook simple meals and doing homework at his kitchen table. Weekends belonged to Margaret's penthouse, filled with dance classes, museum visits, and elaborate tea parties. Judge Coleman had been initially skeptical of the unusual arrangement, but 6 months of successful co-parenting had convinced her. Margaret and Robert had attended family therapy together, learned to communicate about the girls' needs, and created a stable routine that prioritized Emma and Ella's happiness above all else. "You know what's funny?" Robert said, joining Margaret at the kitchen island while the girls set the table. I spent 2 years thinking I wasn't worthy of being their father. You spent months thinking you might lose them, but we were both wrong. How so? Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew his answer. Family isn't about deserving or losing. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. Emma and Ella bounded back into the kitchen, their faces bright with excitement. About their upcoming week. Monday meant school with Daddy. Wednesday meant soccer practice. Friday meant sleepover at Mama Margaret's. Group hug, Ella announced, launching herself at the adults' dot as Margaret wrapped her arms around this beautifully complicated family they'd created. She marveled at how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been a lonely widow going through the motions of living. Today, she was a mother, a co-parent, and part of something bigger than herself. Mama Margaret, Emma said, looking up at her with those brilliant blue eyes. Are you happy now? Margaret kissed the top of her daughter's head, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. Happier than I ever imagined possible, she replied truthfully. The twins who had begged for help on a cold Chicago sidewalk hadn't just changed Margaret's life. They'd taught her that love multiplies when it's shared, that families come in all forms, and that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as the most unexpected challenges. As they sat down to their imperfect pancakes in Margaret's pristine dining room, she realized she'd found something more valuable than all her wealth combined. A family bound not by obligation or blood, but by choice, forgiveness, and unconditional love. The little girls who had once been homeless now had 2 homes, 2 parents who loved them fiercely, and a future bright with possibility. Margaret Foster had finally learned that the richest life wasn't measured in dollars, but in the laughter of children who called her Mama.